I want to welcome everybody who's joined us. We're going to wait a minute or two for folks to join before we dive into it. Shouts out to everybody in the chat if you want to weigh in about where you're signing in from. Shouts out to Jacques, Marie, Catherine is in the house, Ryan, Barb, Sean, my man Greg,
Welcome, everyone.
Meryl, Douglas, Donald. Forgive me if I missed you. Alex, R.I.P. Steakface in the house, Robert, Sarah, Marinella. What's up, everybody? Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much.
So, yes, please do chime in the chat where you're joining us from.
Yeah.
Welcome, Zen Ben, Robert Taylor, Ellen. This is meant to be a conversation that's not just between JP and myself, but between you as well. So, as we move forward, if you have thoughts or questions, please contribute them into the chat, and we'll try to respond to them to the best of our ability. So, we are going to be talking about Europe, and we are going to be talking about Europe after the United States attack on Venezuela. But before we do, I think it's important to just acknowledge, first and foremost, what is at the top of everybody's mind and in the front of everybody's heart, which is the ICE killing of Renee Nicole Good in Minneapolis. That is the most important thing right now. And that is the story of the day. It's not entirely disconnected from our foreign policy and what we do in Venezuela and how we relate to our allies in Europe. But it's really important. And I imagine that it's on your mind, JP, and for everybody who's tuning and watching this live, it's probably something that you're all thinking about as well. I will just say that, I had a check-in yesterday with Stuart Beckham. The recording of that is on my Substack. And later this afternoon, I'm doing a check-in with your weirdo friend, 2:00 Pacific, 3:00 Eastern. So in just under a couple hours, we're going to be getting together to check in. And that's a space that's going to be devoted much more to domestic political issues, including the American Gestapo, the killing of Renee Nicole Good, and where we go from here. So just want people to know that we've carved out a little bit of space to talk about that. But just as that is happening, Venezuela is still happening. And in belligerent American foreign policy is still happening. And so it's still important for us to talk about that. So I appreciate everybody joining to be a part of this conversation at this time.
Yeah, no, great having you, and great being here. Yeah, I also got news of the ICE killing and also of the Venezuela attacks, and I think that it just generally represents the unbound nature of the Trump administration at this point and the degree of which just the typical sort of norms have just completely failed. And I think that Trump is at this point very unrestrained, and I think there's very little standing in his way and in these types of things happening. And I think that unfortunately that will probably continue for some time because he's a very executive president, and most of his actions just happen via sort of unilateral executive action. So I think even if you have a Congress captured by the Democrats, he will probably continue. And I think it will unfortunately be some time before you really can check him via the government. And I think probably prior to that, you will just have to rely on civil society, I guess, and sort of maybe labor organizations. I think nonprofits who make sure that everybody knows their rights and that kind of thing.
I think this notion of being unrestrained and unchecked is really important. The U.S. Senate passed a resolution that nominally checks the president's actions in Venezuela. We'll see if the House of Representatives passes that bill as well. They probably will, but there's still a veto-proof. The bill does not have a veto-proof majority, which is to say that even if it passes this Congress, Trump could easily veto it. But I'm not convinced that a veto-proof majority would even prevent this administration from acting in total opposition to what Congress says, to what Congress does and demands, which is why this action in Venezuela is wildly unpopular.
Yes.
But that doesn't seem to prevent the administration from moving forward in whatever manner it wants. If I thought that this what happened this week was going to be the end of it, we probably wouldn't be having this conversation in terms of what it
Yeah.
means for Europe. So there were some initial responses from European leaders in like the immediate 24 hours
Yeah.
that were sort of hedged and somewhat a little bit supportive, or and then immediately the message from the administration, the US administration, they started talking about Greenland and Denmark. And so my question for you is, and maybe start with Germany since that's where you are and that's where you have more experience and expertise. We could also speak about Western European leaders more broadly. But my question for you is like, how intense do you think that sense of whiplash is? And do you think there was an awareness from the outset that what starts in Venezuela isn't going to end in Venezuela? And how do you think European leaders right now are thinking about how to respond to a Trump administration that has is expressing belligerent imperial designs not just in the southern hemisphere but against some of our NATO allies?
I think that generally speaking, uh, it's my okay, no. Um, I think generally speaking, European leaders are very they're attempting to sort of make Trump less angry at them. They're attempting to calm him down. They're attempting to play nice with him. I think that the reason for this is that Europe, it works a certain way, and the politicians in Europe, they operate on a certain kind of framework institutionally, which is distinct from the United States. I think Germany is especially an example of this. It it often produces these very bureaucratic leaders. It's a very sort of consensus oriented country, and oftentimes you don't have these sort of grand confrontational people like Trump. I think France is a little bit different. They tend to like this sort of grandeur, as it's called, a bit more. But the Germans and also the EU, they tend to be bureaucratic. And I think that that limits what they can do because if you're a bureaucrat, you have a certain kind of experience. And the experience that you have is you're given a certain task and you accomplish that. But you don't really make important directional decisions. So you accomplish a certain sort of small task that you're given. And
Mm,
the problem with that is that that quite easily turns you into a pushover because you don't have this sort of statesman-like quality which you would need to stand up to somebody like Trump. And what's also important is that Europe being threatened by the United States is a new phenomenon. So for the most part, the idea was that the strategic direction for Europe comes from the United States. So there is this sort of muscle memory in people that,
mm.
well, if something comes from the United States, we're sort of supposed to execute this. Yes, the Europeans sometimes they have an independence streak, like Iraq, France, Germany. They didn't join the Americans in Iraq, but for the most part, they take this sort of broad direction of travel, and that just means that there is no muscle memory of how to stand up. And I think this leads to sort of inertia where Trump does something and they will sort of say, they will sort of murmur, but there will never be any decisive action against Trump. And I don't think you will see it from these leaders until you get something like extremely dramatic, like Trump taking Greenland. But prior to that, I don't think they will really stand up to Trump.
Do you think there's any escalation towards Venezuela or expansion towards Cuba or other countries outside of Europe that could trigger that kind of extreme break from this inherited instinct to follow American leadership?
I think it would have to happen in Europe itself. I think the Europeans will not break from American leadership until something happens which threatens them personally. I think the Europeans, unfortunately, if something happens outside of Europe, if another country is attacked, I don't think that they will have the backbone to say, okay, we're breaking with the Americans because of this. I think this used to happen sometime in the past. Iraq is an example, Vietnam is another example, but I think that that was a different leadership generation. I think the people who governed Europe in the 1950s, people like Adenauer, de Gaulle, the people today, they aren't like that. They're much more small minded. And also, the relative position vis a vis the United States has deteriorated. Europe today is much more dependent and it's much weaker than it used to be, especially compared with the United States. If you look at the GDP of a country like France compared with the United States, it used to be much closer, and now the difference is much bigger. So I think the only thing which could really trigger a break with the United States is if the United States did something which signaled to Europe that they're no longer safe within Europe. So I think the United States possibly withdrawing from NATO would trigger that. I think them taking Greenland might trigger it. I could even see them, if the United States just take Greenland, being like, oh, this is terrible, and oh, we're going to do something and we're going to develop strategic autonomy, and then nothing happens. I could even see that, although I think that's sort of 50-50, I would say. But outside of something dramatic happening in Europe, I don't think you will see a decisive break.
I'm really curious about that part. Like, what is the line? Does it take actual boots on the ground? Is a Twitter statement enough? Where is the line? What's the trigger point? Right? What's it gonna take? Because there's already saber rattling. There are already articulations. So is there some actual is it an some aircraft carriers move? Is it right? Troops, what's it going to actually take? Because we are already seeing a lot of things. And if I'm a European leader, I want to be proactive, right? I would think that I would want this. You want to be proactive. And so if not now, when? What is the line? Does it actually require uh does it require uh a tactile conflict? Does it require an actual physical seizure? The likes of which we saw in Venezuela.
I think it would take something which would effectively show the people that NATO is defunct. I think if that happened, then you would see a break. But I think prior to that, you won't see it. So I think if the United States attacked Greenland, that would essentially mean that NATO is sort of meaningless because it would be an Article 5 situation. And you couldn't trigger Article 5 because the most important country which backs up Article 5 is gone. So I think it would have to be something which really shows that NATO is defunct. It just doesn't do anything anymore. I think that would do it. I think prior to that, nothing will do it. I think it's just uh, peoples are creatures of habit. One of the most important determinants of human behavior is habit, and the habit of Europeans is to always be diplomatic. Don't try and push things. Don't do any dramatic moves. Don't change your country in a fundamental way. It's always towards bureaucratic management. It's never towards solving crisis on a fundamental level. It's always towards we're going to manage the crisis. We're going to weather the storm. And so I think it would have to take something which just destroys the European security order before any sort of real adjustment happens.
There was a comment in the chat. Paul M said that Keir Starmer is being compared with Chamberlain there, which
Yeah, I
rings true to me. This feels like Trump is in his Hitler era, and if appeasement didn't work then, there's a point at which we realize that appeasement isn't going to work now. And that does tie in with the Nicole Good shooting. And people have been sharing the Anne Frank quote about terrible things happening in the streets. That stuff is particularly pertinent when we call Trump a Hitlerian figure. It's not just a global belligerence.
Yeah.
It's also an authoritarian instinct at home. But to the point about Chamberlain and appeasement, that's how I think about it. Do you think European leaders see it as though they've been appeasing something that they should? Is that the right frame?
I think it sort of is the right frame, but I think in a way the European leaders today are almost in a worse position compared with Chamberlain, because the advantage which European leaders had back then was that at the very least countries like Britain and France didn't have major fascist movements themselves. They had fascist movements, they had Nazi sympathizers, but it wasn't a major phenomenon. But nowadays, not just are you threatened by Trump from the outside, but you also have forces very similar to Trump rising within your country, and they're major, major, major political forces. So I think in a way the position of European leaders today is almost worse because you don't just have an outside threat, you also have a complete collapse of support within your own country. And that collapse of support really affects how you can conduct foreign policy. Because one of the problems with the Europeans is also you have leaders whose political base of support is eroding. And if you don't have any domestic support, you can't really do anything on foreign policy which would remedy the situation, right? Because so take Ukraine. So people say, okay, the Europeans need to do more for European security because the Americans are going. But if the leaders don't have any popular support within their own countries, you can't then do anything dramatic in terms of raising troops or militarizing your country or sending troops anywhere. And so I think the situation is almost worse because you have a domestic problem which compounds the foreign policy problem.
In terms of the relationship with the US, we've spoken before about the Trump era being a catalyst for changes that were already well underway
Yeah.
and sort of breaking apart old frameworks and relationship dynamics that didn't really serve Europe's long-term interest. I'm curious how these developments, um, how you think that contributes to such a catalyst for change, and also, is there an alternative model that still relates to superpowers? In other words, we've mused about a European autonomous system that doesn't have to rely on the US the way that it has. But I do wonder about the BRICS countries. I wonder about other countries with great wealth and influence that could step in and sort of seize that aversion, make a new version of the historical role that the United States has played as it relates to Europe. What do you think?
I think that that's very difficult. And I think the reason why it's difficult is because European autonomy, a lot of people agree on Europe needs to be more autonomous. The problem is they don't agree in which way this autonomy should happen. Because a lot of people who are more liberal, oftentimes more globalist, you might say, believe in Eurofederalism. And so they believe, okay, the way for Europe to become independent of the United States is for them to form one state. But a lot of more nationalist people don't believe in that. And they believe that Europe should become independent, should become sort of its own thing, but that should happen via the independent nation states. And the only way for Europe to be assertive, you have to destroy the EU or weaken the EU. If you don't want to completely collapse it, you need to weaken it. You need to give power back to the nation states. And so I think that that also compounds it because there isn't even an agreement on what the strategy should be. And I think probably this will maybe get somewhat better just because I think that nationalists in Europe have all the political momentum and I think they are just going to dominate the continent. And so I think for in 3, 4, 5 years, you will have clarity because nationalists will just be dominant, will govern, and I think that will create a certain clarity. Although I don't think it will create
Right.
politics, which I agree with.
Yeah, that's terrifying. Can we just sit with
Yeah,
that for a minute? Because I think this is generally understood to be the valence of where the energy is in terms of
yeah.
maybe one step forward, two steps back, but generally it's back is kind of been the trend line. So let's play that out 3 years, 5 years, 10 years down the line. If the nationalist movements or the global, the international network of nationalist supremacist movements are collectively gaining power in Europe, then well, what does that mean for regular people like you? And what does that mean for the transatlantic dynamic?
I think in terms of for regular people, I think the single biggest factor will be immigration, and I think that one of the unfortunate things is that I think actually the European right wingers are much more radical on immigration than Trump is. I'm not. I think Trump already is very radical, but I think the European nationalists are more radical. And I think especially in Germany because if you look at the what's called the Neue Länder, the new parts of Germany, which used to be the GDR, they are much more ethnically cohesive. So in the United States, most parts of the United States are to a certain degree ethnically diverse. But within Germany, you have an entire section of Germany where there are very, very few immigrants. And so these people are much more consistent in being ethnic nationalists to a certain degree. I think the AfD is especially extreme. I think also that the AfD, sort of sociologically, it has been shut out from power for so long that it has radicalized in a way which I think goes beyond other nationalist forces. So I think in terms of domestic politics, you will see the same thing you see with Trump, which is a crackdown on immigration, but I think it will be more severe, and I also think it will be more consistent. So I think that you will essentially have the Trump policy, but implemented much more, much in a much more extreme way and in a much more consistent way. And I think that that will really affect quite a number of people. Also because Europe, for the most part, doesn't have birthright citizenship, which is as entrenched as it is in the United States. I think on the international point, I think that you will kind of get I think at first you will get a kind of attempt to accommodate the United States by being more akin to them politically. So I think the instinct of somebody like Nigel Farage or somebody like the AfD will be, we will get the United States back on our side by basically adopting their politics. So we will hope that Trump, MAGA, will not be as angry at us if we have the same politics. The idea is right now the Americans, they're dealing with these sort of globalist, these sort of internationalist bureaucrats, and they don't like this. And if we become more based and more right wing, then they will like us again and they will be nice to us again. I think this will be a temporary phenomenon. I think that in the long run, I think that the more independent nationalists will probably be more influential. I think if you look at a party like the National Rally, they tend to be a little bit more hesitant to sort of embrace transatlantic trends, which is also just sort of something in French society. They're not as servile. I mean, they are quite servile, but they're not servile, let's say, the British. And so I think that at first you will just get basically this, okay, we're like you. Trump was right about everything. We're so wrong. We apologize. We Immigration was terrible. Oh my God, we let in all these people and we're gonna crack down on them and you're right about everything. Please, please, please like us again. Please defend us. Please, blah, 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 blah. And I think then over time you will begin to see a little bit of more of a strategy as to how Europe could become more independent from, I think, some of the smarter nationalists. I think the sort of stupid people would just be like, we're European MAGA, but I think the smarter people will begin to kind of look at, okay, what does Europe look like once the US is gone? And I think the smartest thing you could do probably would be to sort of take away some competencies from the EU, make it a little bit less powerful, but then try and make the competencies which remain work better. And I think that some of the more canny people in Europe will maybe attempt that, but I'm not sure.
Well, what would be one example of that? Like, what would be a competency that you'd want to ratchet up the improvement to?
I think probably, um, I think, for example, I think one of the best elements of the EU, one of the ideas they had which functions the best is the common market. And so I think one of the smartest things you could do is change the way that the EU works and try and get supranational people, but who are elected, who are directly elected. And I think one of the advantages that that would have is that politics, it's not just about how big is your market, it's also about how much can you actually command the respect and the buy-in from your populace. And one of the problems with the EU is that you have people who are supposed to represent Europe, but they weren't elected. They were selected in some Byzantine way. And so when these people basically stand in front of the European populace and say, okay, we need to do this thing, and that thing requires any sort of sacrifice, they don't have the legitimacy to say that. And I think that inherently weakens the EU because because people know that they don't have this legitimacy, they become very conservative and they become very status quo oriented. They just sort of do everything which is uncontroversial, but nothing which would be difficult. And so I think it would make sense to try and elect some sort of authority which manages the common market. And I think that would also be smart because nowadays what we see is that states sort of compete in ways where they weaponize their economics. So you don't see this sort of free trade neoliberal model again. You see something where instead of just having the market decides, what you see is national governments like Trump, they weaponize economics. So they will do targeted sanctions. They will attack countries to steal certain kinds of resources. So what you see is this sort of integration of economics and geopolitics. And I think if you had an actually elected person rather than a bureaucrat, I think they could do that at least a little bit. And then I think one of the areas where I would say you should just sort of cancel it and call it quits is the Eurozone. I think that the Eurozone, it only works if you do a sort of fiscal union, if you actually have a common EU-wide tax policy. But I think if you have nationalists in power, that's not going to happen. And so I don't think with people like the AfD or the National Rally, I don't think you can make the Eurozone work. And so I would just say go back to national currencies in that regards and try and make the common market work better.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that level of detail. That's why I love having you. But just want to pause to
Happy to
welcome
provide.
everybody who's here. There's a great group. Don't be shy in the chat if you want to let us know where you are chiming in from, questions, comments. Shout out to Lawrence Loomer, who said that decentralization, nationalism first,
Yep.
one single state later seems like a good perspective. Definitely rings true for me.
Yeah.
Something that I was thinking about when you gave your prior response about adapting to a more mega foreign policy as a way to sort of not appease in the World War II sense of the word, but as a way to sort of go along to get along. That just strikes me as extremely precarious because you don't know what's going to happen in 3
Yeah.
years with under a different administration, you know, Republican to Democrat. But it's also inherently precarious under MAGA because Trump himself
Yeah.
is so erratic and so inconsistent. So it seems like kind of a risky bet. That said, over the long arc, I think there is somewhat of an unbroken neoconservative approach to American foreign policy that is deeper than Trump or Biden or Harris or Obama. And that isn't likely to change too dramatically too quickly. So, to the extent that Trump is a continuation of that, I think tuning in on that and saying we're going to orient ourselves toward that worldview, maybe with language that makes Trump feel good, maybe with language that mimics the mega messaging and the branding. So the surface level alignment tracks, but the underlying foreign policy orientation is also primed to follow the United States wherever we may go.
Yeah, and I think the single biggest thing which makes the relationship between the United States and Europe unstable is the fact that China is so strong. Because everybody knows that the number one priority for the United States is China. The most important competitor which the United States perceives is China. And so because China is so important, it destroys the transatlantic relationship because the transatlantic relationship was built on Europe knowing that the number one priority of the United States was the Soviet Union. So if you have the United States having to be engaged elsewhere, it doesn't render the United States commitment to Europe credible anymore. And so I think that's the factor which really drives them apart. And the other thing is also the United States, it's not just engaged in Asia, it's also engaged in the Middle East. And so I think if you add these two things up, there's this thing which security analysts often say, which is that the United States has the capability to fight in two theaters, right? So they can fight wars in two places simultaneously, and these two places could be in different regions, but they don't have the capability to fight three regions. And so if the person who is protecting you has the capability to fight in two places, and your priority number three, it's essentially useless. I guess it's a little bit better than useless, but it's very close to useless. And I think that's just what driving them apart.
On the Denmark Greenland of it all, let's just game this out a little bit.
Yeah.
So, a hypothetical paradigm shattering action from the United States. Let's just say, hypothetically, President Trump sends out a Twitter notification or a Truth Social notification saying, Greenland is the 51st state, and sends a troop deployment,
Yeah.
and and there are American boots on the ground. No conflict, no leader deposed. Not as hot as what we saw in Venezuela, but a presence, an occupation, small, couple thousand, but an official statement, and then maybe a press conference that reinforces that you know your Greenland now belongs to us. What then from European leaders?
I think I could. I mean, I think I could see then that scenario NATO collapses because I think maybe in that scenario some countries just leave NATO. Theoretically, I think that could happen. I think the other thing which could happen is the Europeans don't leave NATO. They attempt to keep the alliance going, but they sort of rapidly divest. I think something which would be sort of slightly less radical would be you don't leave NATO, but you leave the integrated command. So you just say, okay, we remain part of NATO and we remain attached to Article 5, but we leave the integrated command and we build our own military structure. And so even though the alliance is still going, you don't have this tight coordination anymore. I think also something you could do, but which I unfortunately don't see them doing, would be you attempt to use sort of your economic size to build leverage over the United States. I think probably the way you could do that if you were competent would be you would attempt to get some sort of deal with China where you would attempt to say, okay, if the United States does a certain thing, then we would cooperate with China on this thing. And you would, I guess, hope that the size of your market means that if you get certain sort of Chinese technology providers in, that would rapidly accelerate their dominance, and that way you can kind of get a certain economic deterrent, so to speak. But
Mhm,
I think none of that is very likely to happen because I don't think the Europeans are prepared for it, and they don't have the institutional
mhm.
the institutional know-how to do it. They
Yeah.
can't act decisively, and so
Are you Are you aware of any sort of preparation, any sort of wargaming? I mean, I know you're not a diplomat or a government insider, but I think you're right that they're not prepared. Nobody's prepared. This is
no.
completely, this is beyond the realm of what anybody would have ever considered realistic or plausible, and yet here we are. So, I mean, do you in your studies or in your conversations with your peers at university, are you aware of any preparation or planning that is occurring for the possibility of such an action?
I I think people are in Germany, at the very least, they're still stuck in the old sort of modes of thinking. In a lot of the segments of German society, the thinking really hasn't evolved, and they don't understand what is happening. And I think you can tell this in Germany. They keep thinking in this kind of old school model where what people used to think is basically you sort of have two axes, right? You have militarism and you have alignment with the United States. And the way it was back in the day was being aligned with the United States meant you were militaristic, and being less aligned with the United States meant you were less militaristic. And also, generally speaking, people who were less aligned with the United States were more supportive of, say, Russia,
Mhm,
or at the time the Soviet Union, right? And this tracked on the left-right axis. The right wanted to be militaristic and wanted to align with the United States, and just like the Soviet Union, the left was still aligned with the United States, still militaristic, and still against the Soviet Union, but oftentimes in a less extreme way. So they would say, yes, we're aligned with the Americans, but we want to be more diplomatic. We don't want quite this military. We want less military intervention, and we want to do detente or something like that. But nowadays it's sort of changed because first up, the right has grown less militaristic, right? Okay, they pretend to be, but on Russia at least. So
Yeah.
you don't have this neat left-right thing anymore. You have a liberal establishment which is hawkish on Russia. You have a right which is hawkish and militaristic with regards to, say, Israel, but pro-Russia and pro-peace, pro-peace in with regards to them. And you have a sort of traditional left, which is still very anti-militaristic, but at the same time as it's anti-militaristic, it wants to reduce the dependency towards the United States. And so you can see how the points sort of clash because the problem of Europe is the fact that you are so militarily weak renders you dependent on the United States. So being less dependent on the United States will involve at least some, not militarism, but building up your military capability because you are dependent on the United States because you cannot defend yourself.
You
And
guys have
even
nukes? Do you have nukes?
sorry,
Uh, does Europe have a nuclear deterrent?
France has nukes, but it's quite small. So the British have nukes, but the British nuclear deterrent is very integrated with the American one. So I'm not sure when this is independent. Also, Britain is very, very tied to the United States, and especially since Brexit. So within the EU, France has nukes, and they have nuclear deterrent. It's not very big, and so if you were to look at the EU and then say Russia, the Russian nuclear capability is much, much, much bigger.
Yeah.
But you do have it. Yes, you have one country which has nuclear deterrent, and also countries like Germany. They are nuclear threshold states. So they don't say this and they always say, we don't want nukes, we don't want nukes, we don't want nukes. But they have the technical capability to build nukes extremely quickly.
Right.
So I think it was stated once there was like minutes. They could build a nuclear bomb within like a couple of
Minutes?
minutes.
Come
Yeah.
on.
I think probably today it's not as strong anymore because we shut down like civilian nuclear. So I think and also the sort of technological capabilities of Germany have declined. But I think a country like Poland, for example, I think they're very, very close. They don't have nukes, but they have the capability and they could build it quite quickly, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to be interested in the months and years to come on the question of nuclear proliferation, which is not something I would want to see, but
Yeah, no, me neither.
something that I think this level of American belligerence and
Yeah,
colonial design sort of makes unfortunately plain to a lot of countries what nuclear deterrence can afford you as far as protection. Couple comments in the chat. Cheryl says she doesn't even think Trump knows that we have a military base on Greenland. I certainly didn't know that. In my
yeah.
hypothetical.
I knew it from I think I looked it up yesterday. Yes, they already have a base there.
And Carrie Conkey says that they think NATO would collapse in the event
Yeah,
of.
I probably think so too. At least in part, I think.
Um, other takeaways you have in the immediate aftermath of this Maduro kidnap, in light of the saber rattling towards Greenland and Denmark and other South American countries.
I think that I'm not so sure. I think Trump probably won't directly attack Venezuela again because I think Trump he is very pro war, but he will always do these like quick strikes. So if you looked at the Houthi strike, it was just a small bombing campaign. Same thing with Iran, right? He attacked Iran, but it wasn't a long engagement. And so I think he will be quite hesitant to do anything which quote unquote looks like a forever war. So I think that I think he will probably attempt to talk with the Venezuelan government to where effectively the United States gets control of the oil, but without having to directly militarily intervene. From what I hear, and I'm not at all the security expert, I think people talk about him striking Iran again, so that there's sort of a second wave of attacks on Iran. And I think with Latin America in the immediate future, I think he's likely only to threaten. But then again, I also didn't think he was going to attack Venezuela. So I just
Right.
don't know. I personally would think he will back off a little bit. I think if he is going to do some military action, it would likely be in the Middle East regarding Iran. And I think in a couple of months, he might do some other quick strike where he will maybe, I'm not sure, but I think we might do something in a couple of months, I think.
They say things do heat up with Iran, and the United States and our partners attack Iran again, and Iran attacks Israel, or possibly, other American partners in the region, Saudi Arabia, UAE. What then for Germany? What then for Europe?
I think probably they wouldn't join directly, but I think that they would also not really do anything which might dissuade the United States. I mean, okay, they can't do anything which dissuade the United States because they're not powerful enough. I think what you will actually see is Europe will say something like, okay, we understand why the United States attacks and we don't support Iran, but we think this could have been done better. So they will issue some meaningless statement, I think.
Mhm.
I don't think they would directly join it, but I also think it's just been shown the Germans every time something happens which threatens Israel in even the slightest sort of way, they immediately rush back to defend Israel. So you would have during the Iran, the United States attacked Iran. They said, okay, we don't agree with this entirely. They also added 100 million aspiras. But then Iran shot back, and some of that hit Israel. And then they immediately said, oh, no, we have to defend Israel. This is unacceptable. Why did Iran attack Israel? So I think that will just repeat itself. I don't think they will really do anything, even diplomatically, which could really stop the United States.
Cheryl makes a point. She says this is terrifying. She didn't realize how unprepared Europe is
Yeah.
to stand against Trump. I I do think it is a little startling
Yes.
how there's nobody in leadership under our American executive branch. There's nobody inside this administration to stop Trump. The Democrats in Washington
Yeah.
are either uninterested or incapable of stopping Trump. Forget about the Republicans. European leaders, to your point, don't seem quite capable. It's a little like, is it just us? Is it just the people? Or is it going to boil down to just millions and millions of regular people stopping this because our global leadership is corrupted or complicit or incapable, or have the agency bred out of them through decades of institutional alignment? It is really frightening. I'm not gonna lie.
Yes, it is, and I think that's the fundamental thing. I think Trump is he reveals how the system works, and he reveals that a lot of the the system, the rules which are supposed to the system is supposed to uphold, they don't exist. They are voluntary. The reason why people thought those are the rules is because people in power it suited people in power to pretend that those were the rules.
Yes.
Nothing actually upholds them. And what Trump reveals and what we see again and again and again is that you can just exercise power. You can just overpower people. There's nothing that they can do. And I think in a weird way, Trump, as much as distasteful as he is, I think that he, in some ways, is more prescient about the way the system works than many other people are, because what Einstein said is insanity is doing the same thing over and over and over again and expecting different results. And I think in that sense, a lot of the people around Trump are sort of more insane than he is almost because they are just doing the same thing over and over again and they're expecting the results to change. They keep invoking these rules which don't exist. There's no mechanism to uphold them. And I keep saying, oh, but you can't do that, but you can't do that, but you can't do that. But he just can. And I think that it is a very disheartening thing, but I think it's also in a kind of a weird way an optimistic thing because it just reveals at the end of the day the only thing which can stop people like Trump and also his sort of offshoots in Europe is a political movement which of similar intensity. You cannot defeat Trump via any sort of rule or any sort of bureaucratic maneuver. the system doesn't have the capability to do that. So at the end of the day, I think you're right. The only thing which will change things will be if there is a political movement which is able to create the same sort of intensity and emotion which MAGA has created, but which has different political aims.
I think you're right. The only caveat that I would offer is I've made the argument before that we need American Nuremberg. I think the events of this week indicate now more than ever before that that is necessary. When I laid out my argument, it was based solely on domestic terrorism that has come from MAGA. Of course, the original Nuremberg focused on on the Nazis' crimes against their own people and on war crimes. And for American Nuremberg to be truly effective, I think it's going to need to look at mega crimes on the international stage and their crimes against American citizens. But one of the triumphs of the original Nuremberg trials, which for all its shortcomings and for all its flaws, which it had quite a few, but one of the triumphs was that of reason over power. That Nuremberg was determined to set rules and follow them in their execution of justice against people that only followed the rules of raw power and broke every other rule. So it was, in a way, holding people to account, but also trying to restore a fidelity to some sort of rules-based order that had been broken along the way, which is what I think we need to do here. I think you're right. Mass movement, a politics that understands power, that understands force for good, for the public welfare, for the Constitution. I think there's a lot to be said there. But I also think that alone is not going to go far enough, and that this is not such an inherent contradiction or conundrum that it cannot be done. That an American Nuremberg can both lock these people up, criminalize MAGA, hold them accountable, set the historical record for the damage that they've done, and cut through propaganda, not just for us, but for the entire global community to see what the United States sees and, how we come out of this horrific era. But it can also be done with the rules of evidence, with a trial by a jury of your peers, right? With the fidelity to standards and practices and procedures that are antithetical to the raw rank abuse of power and exercise of power that Trump has revealed is sort of has been there all along, rather than the illusion of rules that I think you very aptly point have been they've been strategically deployed or followed, where it makes sense to, but they were really always only customary.
Yeah, I think probably I'm very pessimistic on the idea of there being sort of an American Nuremberg, because I think that the thing which I think makes this distinct is that when World War II ended, there wasn't really any sort of popular sympathy for the Nazis left. But I unfortunately don't think that Trump will get to that point, because I think that this movement, this Trump-like politics, it will be the defining political movement of this decade and quite possibly the next. And so I think that makes it very, very difficult to actually do this, because I think you will just repeat what's already happened when Trump got prosecuted, which is that people once more perceive him as an outsider. I think probably, unfortunately, that the ship for that has sort of sailed. I think the ship has sailed either when the Bush administration people didn't get prosecuted, or I think at the very last moment where it sailed was when Trump got reelected. But I think I'm very pessimistic on this, and I think that ideally it would happen, but I think it's very unlikely, and I think that it's not one of the things that I would spend my energy on in terms of building a movement. I get why people want it so much. I get why people want that catharsis, but I think it's unlikely, because I think that to do that, there would have to be a sort of institutional trust which isn't there yet. So I think that the thing you would need for something like that to happen would be there to be a sort of baseline institutional trust again. Because at the end of the day, people perceive courts as institutions. And so, in order for Trump to be held accountable through an institution, there needs to be institutional trust. But I don't think you will get any sort of institutional trust until you have really changed the political dynamics. So I think it's a thing where you're sort of putting the cart before the horse. I think, and so I
I
think
I
I
hear
would
you.
okay. So I think I would try and focus more on just trying to create a political movement which changes things materially. I think unfortunately that's quite unlikely, but I could be wrong. I hope I am.
Well, no, I hear you, and I appreciate what you're saying. I think there's a practical reality here to consider. I also think that you can walk and chew gum at the same time. I think American Nuremberg is a rallying cry as far as a movement slogan. I think justice and accountability can coexist with a movement that improves people's material conditions. And our American Nuremberg and hardcore democratic socialism are two coexistent campaign platforms that are just a more advanced version of what Democrats have been running on softly since Trump was reelected, right? Trying to tie the corruption and the evil and the horror and the harm of this administration with their economic wreckage and with their destruction of quality of life and erosion of quality of life. These two messages already coexist. I'm just talking about an intense ratcheting up of both of them. And to your point about institutional trust, I think that's true, but I mean, it's you're kind of making, it's like a chicken or the egg thing, right?
Yeah.
If we don't hold these people accountable, then institutional trust is going to be further eroded. Like that's part of the problem why people
Mhm.
don't right is and so just to be clear, when I talk about American Nuremberg, I'm not talking about Justice Scalia and Justice Jackson and
Yeah.
Justice Kennedy. No, it's completely different. It's a brand new structure. It's a brand new set of laws and rules. It's an entirely separate, sort of self-contained uh, uh, set of determinations and accusations and institutions erected for this sole purpose, because this is a sole and unique grievance in the history of our nation and our society, which means it demands its own unique response, and it is an erection of institutions and an erection of processes that exist wholly outside those that are already not trusted and seen as corrupt, and in many ways are corrupt. Now, could that have a downstream effect to rebuild some trust in some of these other institutions? Maybe, hopefully, but just to be clear, I'm not proposing that, the same Supreme Court justices that gave Trump immunity for January 6th are going to be the ones that send him to the guillotine. Paul M. makes a good point in the chat about the ICC might provide a Nuremberg-like framework. And others have made the argument that there are already existing laws that can be prosecuted against Trump and against administration allies, both domestically and in the international court.
Yeah, I think probably what I think is gonna happen actually, assuming that you have somebody from the Democrats, and let's assume even somebody from the left who wins, I think that, and assume they don't win against Trump themselves. I think what I would assume would happen is that you basically get sort of a gentleman's agreement with Trump, where Trump basically says, "Okay, we accept this election," and so I'm not going to say that it was stolen, but I think probably the deal is going to be that because of that he just sort of gets to sail off into the sunset. I think that's likely to happen. I think I agree with you that it's a chicken and egg dilemma, but I think we kind of got proof of the chicken and egg thing of what's the chicken and what's the egg. Because we already had Trump face criminal accountability, and I think what him winning again shows, or to me, what I made of it is okay. People perceive the criminal accountability to be the chicken, right? And they perceive you have to do better as the X. So I personally, what I took away from Trump winning again is you have to change the circumstances which made Trump happen prior to where you can go after Trump. And because I think that people already didn't like Trump in 2024, but people said basically, okay, we won't allow you to go after Trump until you do something about the sort of circumstances which led to Trump. And I think it's the same thing again. And so because of that, I think you can make sure that a Trump-like figure doesn't rise again. But I think, unfortunately, I think Trump has simply accumulated too much power for too long and has been too popular and influential for too many people to where I think he would realistically face accountability. But like I said, I really hope I'm wrong.
Well, we'll see. I have
Yeah.
a Substack live at this time on Sunday at noon my time, 3 o'clock Eastern, with our friend John Newman. And John makes the point that impeachment now is the bare minimum from
Yeah.
any Democratic elected official, any Democrat running in a primary, that given this murder of Renee Nicole Good and the murder of many other people in ICE custody or under ICE attack, that anything shy of a loud and proud push for impeachment is political malpractice. I mean, we're going to talk about it more, but that's the thrust of the conversation that I'm going to have with John on Sunday. So definitely look forward to that. And like I said at the beginning of this conversation, for those who weren't yet present, we are going to be talking about the ICE killing more specifically in an hour. I have a live stream with your weirdo friend. We're going to be checking in, talking about the events of this week, the propaganda, the misinformation, and where we go from here. So, Venezuela and all this stuff is important, but that's important too. So please do be sure to tune in.
Check it out.
JP,
Yeah.
appreciate you coming here. For
Of
folks
course.
who
Of course.
don't
And
follow you, why don't you tell us a little bit about your Substack?
yeah, my Substack is called The Old Continent, and it's about primarily European politics, but also politics more broadly. Originally the idea was just writing about European politics, but the scope sort of widened. And I write quite a bit about sort of political conflict and oftentimes about the history. And I think that the Substack, if I think it will suit you, and reading it you will enjoy it. I think if you're sort of interested in how did the political conflict which we have right now, the political circumstances we have right now, develop. And I think that I try and sort of give more of a longer term view about how the left developed, how the right developed, and also a lot about sort of European history and that kind of stuff.
Excellent. Definitely subscribe. For now, it is all free. For now, take advantage
For
of it
now, yeah.
before any of this stuff gets paywalled. Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, thanks again for being with me here today, and I definitely look forward to
Well, I
doing this
enjoyed
with
it.
you
It was
again
great.
soon.
Yeah, we'll speak again soon, and I'm looking forward to it. And yeah, I really enjoyed it. And have a nice evening, everyone. And thank you for having me.
Ciao.
Bye.